Imagine a line of soldiers stretching as far as the eye can see, thousands of men polished in bronze and iron, convinced that victory is an absolute certainty. They have the numbers, they have the equipment, and they have the backing of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. Yet, within a matter of hours, that entire force will vanish, not because of a lack of courage, but because of a single catastrophic error in judgment. We often look at history through the lens of the victors, but the most profound lessons are actually hidden in the wreckage of the defeated. Throughout human history, there have been moments where the impossible happened, where a dominant superpower was brought to its knees by its own hubris, a change in the weather, or a tactical genius who saw a gap that no one else noticed. Today, we are diving deep into the most monumental military failures ever recorded. These aren't just losses, they are total collapses that reshaped the map of the world and changed the course of civilization forever. Strap in, because we're going to look at the moments where everything that could go wrong did go wrong in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. We begin our journey in the forests of ancient Germany, in the year 9 of the Common Era. This is the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, a moment that effectively ended the Roman Empire's dreams of expanding across the Rhine. Rome was at the height of its power. Under Augustus, they believed they were destined to rule the entire world. They sent Publius Quinctilius Varus, a man more suited to administration than frontier warfare, to govern the Germanic tribes. Varus made the fatal mistake of treating the local tribes like a conquered, tax-paying province before the military work was actually done. But his biggest mistake was trusting a man named Arminius. Arminius was a Germanic chieftain who had been raised in Rome, served in the Roman military, and even attained the rank of knight. He knew exactly how the Roman legions operated. He knew their rhythms, their formations, and most importantly, their weaknesses. Arminius lured Varus and 3 entire legions, plus thousands of civilians and support staff, deep into the dense, swampy forests of Germany under the guise of an uprising that needed to be suppressed. The Romans, weighed down by heavy baggage trains and marching in a thin, miles-long line through narrow paths, were a sitting target. When the ambush began, it wasn't a single battle, but a 4-day nightmare. The Germanic tribes used the terrain to perfection, launching hit-and-run attacks from the cover of the trees. The Roman heavy infantry, designed for open-field combat, couldn't form their famous shields walls in the mud and the thickets. By the end of the 4th day, 3 legions had been completely erased from existence. When Emperor Augustus heard the news back in Rome, he famously wandered his palace, banging his head against the walls and screaming, "Varus, give me back my legions." This defeat was so absolute that Rome retreated behind the Rhine and never again made a serious attempt to conquer Germany, a decision that would dictate the borders of Europe for the next 1,000 years. Moving forward in time, we arrive at one of the most lopsided victories in history, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. This was the 100 Years' War, and the French were defending their home soil against the English King Henry V. On paper, the French should have won in an afternoon. They outnumbered the English at least 3-1, and their army was composed of the finest armored cavalry in the world, the heavy knights. The English, on the other hand, were exhausted, suffering from illness, and hungry. They were trapped in a muddy field between 2 thick forests. But the French leadership was a mess of aristocratic ego. Every French noble wanted to be in the front line to capture the English king for ransom. When the battle began, the English longbowmen rained thousands of arrows down on the French. To escape the barrage, the French knights charged through the deep, sticky mud of the freshly plowed field. Because there were so many of them crowded into a narrow space, they began to trample one another. The weight of their heavy armor made it impossible to move in the muck. As the first wave fell, the second wave pushed forward, literally climbing over the piles of their own comrades. The English, lightly armored and nimble, simply stepped into the chaos and dismantled the French nobility with hammers and daggers. It was a massacre born of pure overcrowding and poor terrain management. The flower of French chivalry was plucked in a single afternoon, leaving the country leaderless and vulnerable for a generation. Now, let's look at a disaster on an even more massive scale, the Mongol invasion of Japan in 1281. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, had conquered China and now had his sights set on Japan. He assembled the largest naval armada the world had ever seen at that point. Over 4,000 ships and more than 100,000 men. The Japanese defenders were brave, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned by the Mongols' gunpowder bombs and superior organization. It looked like the end of Japanese independence. But the Mongols made the mistake of delaying their full landing, keeping their massive fleet anchored in the Hakata Bay. Then, the weather intervened. A massive typhoon, which the Japanese would later call the kamikaze, or divine wind, tore through the bay. The Mongol ships, crowded together, were smashed against each other or driven onto the rocks. Thousands of vessels were lost, and the vast majority of the invasion force was swallowed by the sea or stranded on the beaches to be picked off by the Japanese. The greatest empire in history was defeated not by a sword, but by a storm. This failure was so profound that the Mongols never tried again, and it created a myth of Japanese invincibility that would last until the 20th century. It's a reminder that no matter how many soldiers you have, nature always has the final vote. Speaking of nature, we cannot talk about military defeats without mentioning Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. This is the gold standard for how to lose an empire in 6 months. Napoleon entered Russia with the Grande Armée, a force of over 600,000 men, the largest ever assembled in European history up to that point. He expected a quick, decisive battle, but the Russians, led by Mikhail Kutuzov, refused to play by his rules. They practiced a scorched earth policy, retreating deeper into the Russian interior and burning every farm, every grain silo, and every house along the way. Napoleon was winning every battle, but he was losing the war. He finally reached Moscow, only to find the city abandoned and soon engulfed in flames by the Russians themselves. With no food, no winter supplies, and the Russian winter approaching, Napoleon was forced to retreat. This is where the disaster turned into a tragedy. The French army, dressed in summer uniforms and carrying heavy loot, was harried by Cossacks and freezing temperatures that dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Men fell in the snow by the thousands. By the time the Grande Armée limped back into Poland, fewer than 20,000 of the original 600,000 were still in any condition to fight. Napoleon's invincible reputation was shattered, and the map of Europe was wide open for his rivals to move in. It was a defeat caused by the arrogance of thinking that logistical reality didn't apply to a genius. A similar fate awaited the next person who tried the same thing. In 1943, at the Battle of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army found itself in a situation remarkably similar to Napoleon's. They had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, driven by the belief that the Slavic people would collapse under the weight of a lightning war. They reached the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River and became embroiled in a brutal, house-to-house struggle. While the Germans were focused on the city ruins, the Soviet generals, Zhukov and Vasilevsky, were planning a massive pincer movement. They targeted the weaker Romanian and Italian troops guarding the German flanks and surrounded the entire Sixth Army. Over 250,000 of Germany's best soldiers were trapped in a pocket. Hitler refused to allow them to break out, promising they would be supplied by air. But the Luftwaffe couldn't deliver even a fraction of the necessary food and fuel. As the winter set in, the German soldiers began to starve and freeze. When General Paulus finally surrendered, it was the first time in history that a German field marshal had been captured in the field. Stalingrad was the turning point of the war, a moment where the momentum of an entire global conflict was reversed, because a leader refused to admit that his front line had become a trap. But military defeats aren't always about land. Sometimes they are about the complete failure of a naval strategy, as seen in the Battle of Midway in 1942. The Japanese Navy, under Admiral Yamamoto, planned to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroy them, effectively winning the Pacific War in one day. They had more ships, more experienced pilots, and the element of surprise. Or so they thought. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval code. They knew exactly where the Japanese were going and when. While the Japanese planes were busy rearming on the decks of their carriers, caught between a land attack and a sea attack configuration, American dive bombers appeared out of the clouds. In just 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 heavy carriers were turned into flaming wrecks. The 4th followed shortly after. Japan lost the core of its naval aviation strength, a loss they could never replace. It was a defeat of intelligence and timing. The Japanese had a perfect plan, but it was based on the assumption that their enemy was blind. In modern warfare, as Midway proved, information is often more powerful than the caliber of your guns. Going back to the ancient world, we have to look at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC. This was the moment Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, decided he wanted military glory to rival Caesar and Pompey. He invaded the Parthian Empire in modern-day Iraq with 7 legions. He was warned about the Parthian cavalry, but he ignored the advice. On a flat, shimmering plain, The Romans were met by a force of Parthian horse archers. The Romans formed their famous testudo or tortoise formation to block the arrows. Usually archers run out of arrows eventually. But the Parthians had a camel train carrying thousands of refills. For hours, the Romans stood under a constant rain of arrows. If they broke formation to charge, the Parthian light cavalry simply rode away while still firing backwards. The famous Parthian shot. If they stayed in formation, they were slowly whittled away. Finally, the Parthian heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, armored from head to toe, charged the exhausted Romans. Crassus was lost, and the Roman standards were captured, a humiliation that Rome wouldn't live down for decades. It was a defeat of traditionalism. The Romans refused to adapt to a new type of warfare, and they paid for it with the total destruction of an entire army. Let's talk about the Battle of Adrianople in 378. This is often cited as the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. The Goths, fleeing the Huns, had been allowed into the Roman Empire as refugees, but they were treated so poorly by Roman officials that they rose in rebellion. Emperor Valens, eager for glory, decided to attack the Gothic camp without waiting for reinforcements from the west. It was a hot August day, and the Roman soldiers were tired and thirsty after a long march. As the Roman infantry attacked the Gothic wagons, the Gothic cavalry, which had been out foraging, suddenly appeared on the Roman flank. The Roman lines were crushed together so tightly that the soldiers couldn't even draw their swords. They were tumbled over and trampled. Emperor Valens himself was lost on the field. This was the first time a Roman emperor had fallen in battle against barbarians on Roman soil. It shattered the aura of Roman invincibility and proved that the heavy Gothic cavalry was the new master of the battlefield. It was a defeat of impatience and poor scouting, and it opened the floodgates for the eventual fall of Rome. In the Middle Ages, we find the Battle of Hattin in 1187. This was the moment the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was effectively lost. The Crusader army, led by Guy of Lusignan, was lured into the desert by the brilliant Ayyubid Sultan, Saladin. Against the advice of more experienced lords, Guy marched his heavy knights across a waterless plain in the middle of a scorching July heatwave. Saladin's forces stayed at the springs, well-fed and hydrated. They set fire to the dry grass around the Crusaders, filling their lungs with smoke and heat. By the time the Crusaders reached the horns of Hattin, they were so dehydrated they could barely stand. Saladin's archers and light cavalry made quick work of them. The true cross, the holiest relic of the Crusaders, was captured, and the kingdom was left without an army to defend its cities. Jerusalem fell shortly after. This was a defeat of leadership and logistics. The Crusaders allowed their enemy to dictate the location and the conditions of the battle, making their defeat a mathematical certainty long before the first sword was swung. Now let's consider the Spanish Armada of 1588. King Philip II of Spain sent a massive fleet to invade England and restore Catholicism. The Armada was huge and well-armed, but the English had smaller, faster ships and longer-range guns. The English harried the Spanish all the way up the English Channel, never allowing them to anchor and pick up the invasion army waiting in the Netherlands. Finally, the English used fire ships to scatter the Spanish fleet at Calais. The Spanish, unable to return through the Channel, were forced to sail all the way around Scotland and Ireland. They were hit by legendary Atlantic storms. Without proper maps of the coast and with ships already damaged, dozens of vessels were wrecked on the Irish rocks. Only about half the fleet made it back to Spain. This was a defeat of rigidity. The Spanish had a plan that relied on perfect coordination in an era where communication was impossible. The English, by being flexible and staying out of reach, allowed the sea to do the heavy lifting for them. In more modern times, the Battle of the Somme in 1916 stands as the ultimate example of the failure of trench warfare. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, with 20,000 of those being lost entirely. The commanders believed that a week-long artillery barrage had destroyed the German wire and trenches, but the Germans had deep concrete bunkers. When the whistles blew and the British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and walked slowly across no man's land, the German machine gunners simply climbed out of their holes and opened fire. It was a defeat of unimaginative leadership. For months, the generals continued to order the same types of attacks, resulting in hundreds of thousands of lives lost for a gain of only a few miles of mud. It changed the British psyche forever, turning an entire generation against the idea of romantic warfare. It was a demonstration that technology, specifically the machine gun and rapid-fire artillery, had turned the traditional offensive into a suicide mission. History also gives us the Battle of Asandalwana in 1879. This was a shocking defeat for the British Empire at the height of its Victorian power. A modern British force, equipped with rifles and artillery, was completely overrun by a Zulu army armed mostly with spears and shields. The British made the mistake of underestimating their opponent, failing to properly fortify their camp and spreading their troops too thin. The Zulus used their buffalo horn formation to encircle the British and close the distance before the superior firepower could take its toll. It was a defeat of colonial arrogance. The British couldn't conceive of a native army being able to outmaneuver them. When the news reached London, it was a massive scandal. It proved that numbers and bravery could still overcome technology if the technology was used poorly. The Zulus won a historic victory, even if it eventually led to a much more brutal British response. It remains a case study in why you should never assume your enemy's equipment defines their capability. Another naval catastrophe was the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. The Russian Empire sent its Baltic fleet on an incredible 7-month journey around the world to fight the rising power of Japan. By the time the Russian ships reached the Pacific, they were covered in barnacles, the crews were exhausted, and the equipment was malfunctioning. The Japanese fleet, under Admiral Togo, was fresh, well-trained, and possessed better shells. In a single day, the Japanese Navy destroyed almost the entire Russian fleet. Russia was forced to sue for peace, and for the first time in the modern era, an Asian power had defeated a European superpower. It triggered the First Russian Revolution and signaled the end of the Romanov dynasty's absolute authority. It was a defeat of logistics and morale. The Russian government had sent their men on an impossible mission, and the result was the complete destruction of their naval prestige. We also have the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal's masterpiece. Hannibal, with a smaller, diverse army of Carthaginians, Gauls, and Spaniards, faced a massive Roman army of 80,000 men. Hannibal did something counterintuitive. He allowed his center to weaken and retreat, luring the Romans deep into his line. As the Romans pushed forward, thinking they were winning, Hannibal's heavy cavalry and elite infantry on the wings curved around and closed the gap behind the Romans. The Romans were surrounded in a massive circle. They were packed so tightly they couldn't even swing their arms. In the ensuing hours, almost the entire Roman army was eliminated bit by bit. It was a defeat of pure tactical genius. Hannibal used his enemy's own strength and momentum against them. Cannae is still taught in military academies today as the perfect udaharan of an envelopment. Rome survived, but the psychological scar of Cannae lasted for centuries. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 is another classic. The French military, trying to maintain their colony in Indochina, established a massive base in a valley, believing that the Viet Minh wouldn't be able to bring heavy artillery through the jungle-covered mountains. They wanted to lure the Viet Minh into an open battle where French firepower would win. But the Viet Minh, under General Giap, did the impossible. They disassembled their artillery and dragged the pieces by hand up the mountains, overlooking the French base. The French found themselves trapped at the bottom of a bowl, being hammered by guns they didn't know existed. The airfield was destroyed, making resupply impossible. After 2 months of siege, the French surrendered. This defeat ended French colonial rule in Vietnam and proved that a determined, well-led local force could defeat a Western superpower through sheer willpower and creative logistics. It was a defeat of geographical misunderstanding. Finally, we look at the Gallipoli campaign in 1915. This was a plan by Winston Churchill to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the First World War by capturing Istanbul via a naval and land invasion of the Dardanelles. The plan was plagued by poor coordination, outdated maps, and a complete lack of understanding of the terrain. The Allied troops, including many from Australia and New Zealand, were landed on narrow beaches at the foot of steep cliffs held by the Ottomans. The campaign devolved into a bloody stalemate that lasted for months, with soldiers living in horrific conditions in the heat and the mud. When the Allies finally withdrew, hundreds of thousands of men had been lost for no gain at all. It was a defeat of vanity and poor planning. It nearly ended Churchill's career and became a defining moment of national identity for Turkey, Australia, and New Zealand. It serves as a reminder that an elegant plan on a map is worthless if it doesn't account for the reality of the ground. Each of these defeats tells us something about human nature. They show us that hubris is the most dangerous enemy on any battlefield. Whether it's Varus trusting the wrong man, Napoleon ignoring the weather, or the French knights charging into the mud, the common thread is a refusal to see the world as it actually is. These failures were not inevitable. They were the results of choices made by people who believed they were above the rules of reality. In the end, military history isn't just about who won. It's about why the losers lost. It's about the failure of imagination, the collapse of logistics, and the danger of overextending your reach. These stories are tragic, but they are also essential. They remind us that power is fragile and that even the greatest empires can fall in a single afternoon if they lose their way. As we look back on these monumental collapses, we see that the casualties are only part of the story. The real impact is the change in the world that follows. Teutoburg Forest gave us the borders of modern Europe. Midway gave us the modern Pacific. Agincourt changed the nature of nobility. Every defeat is a catalyst for something new. So the next time you look at a map, remember that the lines weren't drawn by a peaceful hand. They were carved out through moments of incredible bravery and moments of staggering incompetence. History is a record of our mistakes as much as our triumphs. And in the world of military conflict, those mistakes are written in the largest possible scale. The worst military defeats in history serve as a mirror, showing us what happens when we let ego and tradition blind us to the shifting reality of the world. They are the ultimate cautionary tales. Because in the game of history, there is no prize for being the biggest if you aren't also the smartest. Victory is fleeting, but a truly spectacular defeat is remembered forever. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the moments where the world changed through collapse. Stay curious, keep learning, and always look for the story behind the lines on the map. The past is a vast, often dark place, but it's the only way we can truly understand the present and prepare for the future. Until next time, keep exploring the incredible, often brutal, and always fascinating history of our world.